My name is Joyce Volk. I'm the chair-elect of the Salina Area Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors. And I am happy to be here this morning. And would you all stand with me so we can recite the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. These legislative update meetings are sponsored by the Chamber of Commerce and by AT&T. And is Katie Kapal here? Is Katie here? Nope. She's our AT&T representative. We want to thank them for helping us with this event. I want to introduce our legislators, Senator Randall Hardy, 24th District, Representative Steve Johnson, 108th District, and Diana Dirk, 71st District. J.R. Clays of the 69th District will not be with us today. And I think most of you have been here, all of you have been here before, yeah, nodding heads. Okay, so we understand the format. You're new, okay. So what we'll do first is we'll have opening remarks from our legislators, and then you will write questions. There's paper and pencils there. You will write questions, and you can make them specific to a legislator, but if you do not wish, that's fine as well. So we'll have opening remarks from our friends.
Thank you, Joyce, and is this on? Everyone here? And thanks to everyone for coming. I consider this to be the kind of the cornerstone of politics in Kansas. It's when people at the local level come out and want to be informed about what's going on in Topeka that directly affects their lives. And I'm just thrilled to be here this morning and to share information with you. I just want to, as an opening remark, one of my cornerstones is to be transparent. There's been a lot of talk about transparency in government. Well, that's been my goal all along while I was on the city commission and now while I'm in the legislature. And as part of my effort to be transparent, I communicate weekly with anyone that's interested, and I have a newsletter that there's a sign-up sheet in the back. If you are not currently receiving it, around 600 people are, that tells you exactly what went on, how I voted on each issue, and also news that may not appear in any of the newspapers. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a little tidbit about one thing that will be in my next newsletter, give you an idea. Now, we'll be talking, yesterday we had a big meeting on education, and that might be one of the topics that's discussed this morning, but I wanted to let you know prior to talking about that, this is a money statement. And this has to do with our general fund, our state general fund. According to the state general fund profile for fiscal years 2016 through 2022, so it's a 6-year period, Kansas will have a $300 million deficit. This does not include additional funding for K through 12, and it continues the transfer of funding from the state, from transportation to the state general fund. And so we've got a task to deal with in education, but we still have a task to deal with in terms of the state's general welfare as well. So this is, I think I said a year ago that this is going to be a 10-year process, and I think it will. And I think that we are making great strides towards overcoming that deficit, and we've had some good estimate reports recently too, and so that helps. Every little bit helps, but we still have a ways to go, and that's one thing we still need to keep in mind as we talk about other needs in state government. Just a couple things that we did this week on the Senate side. And most of the bills that we're talking about now are House bills. They're coming out of committee on the Senate side, and we've debated them on the floor, and all of these bills have we've acted on. For instance, we passed a bill about alcoholic candy, and to determine which candy has to be controlled by ABC and which candy does not. We raised the amount of alcoholic content in beer from 10% to 15%. So we're up there with wine now, which is kind of interesting. We determined that it was okay to wear tribal regalia. If you want to do that, wear that instead of a aerobic graduation. We changed the licensure requirements for child care facilities that are in recreation centers or schools. We debated something called the Campus Free Speech Protection Act. And this sounds like something that would be an automatic. Well, it failed in the Senate. Failed on a 20-20 vote, which doesn't happen very often. You need 21 votes for anything to pass in the Senate, and this one only got to 20. A bill that I was really in favor of. There was a bill that prohibits gun ownership to those convicted of domestic violence. That's something that I think has been a big topic of conversation. And we also passed a bill concerning firearm reciprocity, so that if you have a concealed carry permit in Kansas, you'd be able to go to Colorado, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and still be legal in those states, and those states would be legal in ours. So those are just a few of the things that we did in the Senate this week, and I'll pass the microphone on to Representative Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stephen Johnson. Great to be with you, and thank you for coming. Most of all, I also appreciate our sponsors, but I really appreciate you coming out, coming distances as well, to be with us this morning. So look forward to your questions. I'll just try and go through yesterday rather than going further back. And there are issues I didn't happen to deal with yesterday that are important, but I would have started with appropriations, where we were going through the budget, and specifically we were dealing with the mental health budget, and there are a lot of needs that are there. I think that the committee did a good job coming up with a number of ideas. They were very creative in finding some things that had worked in other places that we did set aside to see if we could make sure, did that pilot actually work in 2008? Did that study in Oregon work? So that we can focus on whether we need systems, whether we need programs, or whether we need people. And I'm not sure we can do all of that in a year, but I know we can take a next step, and that will be the important thing to do. That's probably the biggest discussion in appropriations. As Senator Hardy said, the main thing is coming up with a balance. The only thing I know about any of the projections, and one of the things from the financial services industry that has been the most useful to me here, is knowing that any projection will be wrong. And the bigger question is your degree of certainty around that estimate. And then you have something you can start to work with in planning for how you move forward. So the 2022 estimate, that's exactly right on our estimate. But in Stephen's little numbers, which are worth nothing to be able to spend, I think we'll be another $200 million ahead in April of this year, which will help to close a number of gaps. I think I'm being conservative on that number, but I don't know. I look forward to May, when I have a little more clarity around what we have to spend this year, and my certainty decreases as I go to 2020, 2021, and 2022. Nonetheless, it is really important, as Senator Hardy mentioned, to make sure we have a structural balance as we move forward to make our commitments and meet them. I think we're much closer to that than we have been. From there, we went to the floor, had some, I'd say, smaller issues on the floor, so I'll skip that. And then we went to the education budget overview, which was very helpful. That's going to be the big discussion going forward. I'm glad to answer your questions on that and give you a thumbnail sketch of what's there. During those times and afterwards, the pension board was meeting. We have had a wonderful chair of the KPERS Board of Trustees. Her name's Lois Cox. She also serves as our executive director of the K-State Foundation. She's dealt with those same portfolio questions in her work life every day, and she has been exceptional at managing the portfolio. And she and the previous chair are the key reason that those of us in the legislature were confident giving them additional $1 billion in a bond, which they invested very well. We're up over $100 million thanks to some phenomenal market performance. But that's over a third of the total outperformance we expected over 30 years, and it just went in 2015. So it's going to go down. It's not going to look this good at some point in the future. But that service was key. I regretted that I couldn't be there to tell her that in person. That position was up, and the governor had the chance to appoint someone else. So, and they have a good person that's coming in, but it'll be difficult to replace that investment expertise. So the portfolio has grown from $12 billion to $20 billion since 2011 when I started watching it, and a lot of that's market performance and then some other things that were done along the way. The tax committee did not meet yesterday, but there are several issues to work with. We have 12 House bills that I would like to advance, although we're at that point where the bills are in the other chamber. So far, we don't have a House bill out of the Senate committee, which is going to create a bottleneck. This week is our last week for committees to meet, then we're on the floor. To get a bill through, you need a House bill, you need a Senate position, and then be able to get to conference. Well, I don't have any Senate positions to put in conference. I don't have a car to rent to get anywhere. So we're talking about some things we agree on and how to work through that, but just the process of getting through it is what I spent some time with the chair of tax and the Senate majority leader to try and figure out how we move that forward. One thing we do have on the House side are other vehicles that we can start if we need to. We've had hearings on property income, sales tax. We have bills in our committee and below the line on the House side. So should there be a change in desire on the tax front, there's a way to respond to it, although there's not a current plan of a major change in revenue. What we are continuing to look at is how we protect the base of revenue. That's been the focus for the last year of the committee that I've been working with in tax. So last year we looked at income. We felt the base was eroding based on the number of folks that were having our LLCs had grown quite a bit, so that issue was addressed. We've been looking at sales tax. We've tried to look at exemptions, which is very hard, and we've got some good additional exemptions to consider. At some point, we may have to look at tax on services. When this was put on in the 30s, we mostly sold stuff. Now our economy is 2/3 services. At some point, we may need to look at taxing services to the end user like we look at taxing goods to the end user, not services in process, not business to business, the architectural plans for another, et cetera. But it would potentially be looking at just how you look at that base. Is that going to create such an issue that taxing goods will be so high that something else has to happen? One thing we are making progress on is the internet sales tax. As we even look here, there are many factors that contribute, but when you can get a wider selection and save 10%, it's hard for a Sears or a Dillard's to keep a footprint in a local place. So looking at that for a variety of businesses, we think it broadens the base, most importantly, as well as might help to level that playing field so that we could keep brick and mortar stores. That's going to be the biggest issue for me in the next hours. Amazon is coming to visit us on Monday. Those of you familiar, they have a wonderful story of wealth creation, and they will be influencing a number of people on Monday on that issue. I still intend to vote on the issue on the floor. It's out of the committee on either Tuesday or Wednesday, which I'm sure will not make them very happy with me. And you may have the opportunity to receive many more postcards on all of us. But anyway, that's what we will be working on there. I actually spent quite a bit of time on that and some other issues. And the other one yesterday, particularly Russell County, but in the Ag Committee and working with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to figure out how we could do a pilot program on industrial hemp so that they would have the chance to plant seeds. Russell County is pretty well situated for that based on the ag community that's there. The economic development folks have been focused on it. And both their city administrator and county manager are ex-law enforcement, which may help them to be able to step forward on it. So those were the issues from yesterday, and I'll be glad to answer your questions as we go forward. Thanks again for being here today.
I guess it's my turn. Okay, are you ready? Okay, let's go. It's such a joy to be here. I tell you, I look forward to these. It's good to see the faces. I love visiting with each and every one of you, and when this session is ended here, I'd be more than appreciative to listen to what some of your concerns are, because that's how we know what kind of bills that we need to be generating. And this last 3 weeks, I have been working diligently on a particular bill that's near and dear to my heart, simply because of the magnitude of what it's going to do. This is Senate bill, or House Bill 2541. This deals with the Kansas National Guard Tuition Assistance Program. There's already a statute with the tuition assistance program, but we want to make some changes. The problem lies in that we do not have the numbers continuing to grow our National Guard. And I had a little saying here, earth, wind, and fire. It doesn't have anything to do with the hippie singers back in the 60s. It has something to do with exactly what they are dealing with. The fires that we had this last year, and then currently, who's the first boots on the ground? The Kansas National Guard. If we have a flood, the Kansas National Guard. If there's anything at all that we need to have protection, the Kansas National Guard is there. And now, with boots on the ground, yesterday I have a step-grandson who just returned from 1 year's service in Kuwait. And he was telling me some real horror stories, and in there, I forgot to bring it with me, but there's a name of this weapon that shoots things over into ISIS, and he says they are taking care of ISIS and really kicking, I won't repeat exactly his terminology. This is a mixed group, okay, all right. But I ran into a brick wall. The bill passed out 119-0 out of the House, sent to the Senate. I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. I have been working with General Taffanelli and his adjutant, Major Graff, who will soon be a lieutenant colonel, and I'll be going to his decoration. And I will give kudos to Major Graff. He has been right on top of it, and I have been visiting with every senator, every House member that I could previously, prior to it going out of the House floor. The big thing is the threats to our nation continue to grow. I mean, they're not stopping. And I'm just going to, if I may, I just put this in my newsletter, and I'll cover the bases so I don't miss anything. This has resulted in greater reliance on the number of the Kansas National Guard, which I just mentioned. Military leaders across the country are struggling to fill their formations due to personnel decreasing population of that both qualified to serve, and this was really a shocker to me, has a desire to do so. There's only 27% of individuals age 18 to 21 who are eligible to serve in the armed forces, and there no longer are because due to medical issues, prior legal trouble, drug use, and other disqualifying factors. So the base of being able to recruit, the numbers are getting smaller and smaller. These factors severely limit the pool of applicants available to fill our ranks and threaten our ability to meet our state and federal missions. As a result, the number currently, sorry, lost my place, or should never leave it. Okay, as a result, the number of soldiers and airmen in the Kansas National Guard has decreased approximately by 16% over the last 10 years. And Kansas currently only has 91% of the soldiers and airmen required. This Kansas House bill, and I refer to that as a Kansas House bill because this is a Kansas bill. The surrounding states are taking care of their numbers and able to recruit the individuals to be their state's National Guard, and we have not been able to do that. What this bill will do is modify the definition of an eligible Guard member to any current member in good standing and who is enrolled at a Kansas educational institution. This is the tuition assistance program that they are saying on this bill. Include Guard members who are entitled to federal educational benefits, modify the level of educational assistance provided to an equal amount of tuition and required fees for no more than 15 credit hours per semester. limit the number of credit hours for which assistance is provided, 150% of the total credit hours required to complete his or her educational program. Clarify that the amount of tuition and fees must not exceed the maximum rate that would be charged by any state educational institution. So they're not going to increase the fees. This actually, the funding for this is the Board of Regents has an educational fund for the National Guard. Last year, Governor Brownback, on his budget, increased what the amount that the Board of Regents were participating with, and brought it from $870,000 to $2.1 million, which made it $3 million altogether for the next 2 years. That is all dedicated to the Kansas National Guard. Well, at least it was. There's a caveat to this, and I would want to be sure and let you know what happened. The bill passed the House. It passed out of the Senate committee. Then the Senate had some issues with funding. I sat in yesterday on the Ways and Means of the Senate, and the funding was cut in half. I'm sure our senator had nothing to do with it. So we're still working on this. Major Graff is right at it. I have been I've been knocking on all the doors of the senators and the House members and to see what we can do about this. And we happen to have a lieutenant governor living within our community of Salinas, so guess who's going to be the next person I'm going to be visiting with. And I will keep you up to date. I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything, so I apologize for reading that. But I think it's vitally important that we support them, the Air National Guard. The National Guard does not have all the benefits that your regular Army and your Air Force has. So we have to supplement with bills such as this and laws in order for them to really recruit them to be, they have to serve in the National Guard for 2 years. It's one stipulation. But I think it's a great bill. Everybody thought so. But I'm hoping that the Senate Ways and Means didn't have some other places for that money. I'm sure they did. But I'm going to see if we can't get that extracted once again. So I'm still working on it. I'm not giving up. Just ask my husband. If I get some idea and I want to have it pass, it will. I just wanted to tell you that. Excuse me. Been fighting this all week. Veterans Committee, some of the bills that we passed out of the Veterans Committee was 2132, which is adding employees of the Kansas Commission on Veterans Affairs to the list of safety-sensitive positions for pre-employment drug screening. This is mean anybody who serves on that commission has to pass a drug test. Amending House Bill 2174, amending the definition of disabled veteran for distinguished license plate eligibility. Another one was 2257, providing for armed services occupation medical license plate. They're going to be changing the license plates. They're not going to be the metal ones. They're going to be fiberglass.
Called digital. It's flat.
It's flat. It's just digital. No embossed at all. And I'm hoping that I can still get the same license plate I have because my husband has it memorized. One of the things that came out of the Veterans Committee is starting in the military, the Indian nations live on their own ground and are not subject to paying Kansas state taxes. Those veterans who served in the armed forces during the time they were serving inadvertently had their Kansas tax taken out of their money. So we passed a bill, 2147, and they're not asking for a refund. They just want diligence where it's due. And so therefore they would like to see it go into, like you have your unclaimed property tax, you have unclaimed, you go to the treasurer, okay, that's where they're going to put it, is unclaimed property. So those who feel that they have that coming back to them can go, but we're not going to go through a refund process. And that passed. I thought that was a really good bill. Getting down to education because that's going to be a big one. there was a bill on the floor, I do not recollect the number, but there was a bill on the floor that anytime you have a bill that anybody feels is germane, they can add an amendment. Again, Medicaid expansion was tried. Again, it failed. But I do have something from the Kansas Health Institute that said in 2016, 239,578 Kansans who are uninsured, including 36,752 children ages 0 to 18, are uninsured, ranking Kansas below 30 other states and similar to U.S. average of 8.5%. I think that is absolutely devastating. We have an aging population, and we have children who are going hungry, who are not getting the benefit of proper medical care. I know there are programs, but Medicaid expansion is one of a key thing that we diligently need to keep track of and keep fighting for. Couple of bills that came out of the Education Committee. One was House Bill 2578, and this had to do with bullying. We had passed a bullying bill a couple of years ago that we called Lauren's Law. But this one actually dealt with bullying policies, websites. The kids are they're being bullied on the internet. And this has to stop. So this bill will make it, this is going to put some teeth into the bullying bill. There were a couple of amendments added to it, but that was House Bill 2578. Now, what happened to this bill, I like to lay my papers out, sorry. I know everybody has these little tiny computers, but by the time I found what I wanted to talk about, this would be over. Okay. There was a task force. One bill was a task force, 2602, is a task force of groups together on looking at dyslexia in our schools. A lot of our kids may have some problems with dyslexia, and they're not found to have dyslexia, and so therefore they're behind the curve in their learning. And so what this is going to do, it's going to form a task force and look into this dyslexia program and get something done there. On the bullying bill, I think what I'm going to do is so that we can get on with some questions because they're very important, but I hope somebody asks me a question about due process, and I'll be happy to tell you what happened there this time. So thank you.
All right. Okay. So we have lots of good questions. And interestingly enough, most of them I've kind of divided them up into topics, and most of them have to do with education funding. And then, of course, the next most popular is our gun regulations. So I am going to start with a little bit of public education first. Some of them are kind of duplicates. So I think these three I can pretty much, I'm going to read everything on the pages, and you'll see how they kind of correlate. Kind of the same question, but with a little different information. Susan Weigel stated after yesterday's disclosure of the education finance study revealed significant increase in funding from $1 to $2 billion. This, and this is in quotations, this will be a loss to the taxpayer. Please share your thoughts. And then hold that thought. The state's legislators' own study says schools in Kansas need up to $2 billion to support schools adequately. How will we do that? And then what can you do to change the view of increased education spending as a loss to taxpayers as a win for Kansas children? So kind of the same issue. So we're talking about the education study and who's delved into that. And how can we change the attitude about funding education to be a win instead of a burden on taxpayers? Did I make that too complex?
I'll start with that and let the expert on the figures answer all the questions. Okay. Yesterday, I mean, this was like waiting for a grand opening of a movie theater. We've been waiting since beginning of the session for this 157-page evaluation of estimating the costs associated with reaching student achievement expectations for Kansas public education, a cost function approach. Well, ta-da, at 1 o'clock, and not 1 minute before or 1 minute after, at 1 o'clock, we were introduced, the two attorneys for this, one for the Senate and one for the House. Take care of that, okay. There we go. Two attorneys, one for the House and one for the Senate, were called upon to answer questions. Unfortunately, they had only seen this report at 6:30 that morning, so they were not aware of everything going on as well. And they kept referring to certain pages, and I'm going to be poking holes in this and putting it in a binder because you're switching back and forth. But I'm going to be sitting down and reading it this weekend because we're going to be meeting once again. What I found to be ironic, this over $230,000 study already found some errors, one of which is in weightings when they were talking about the school populace in certain areas, had a very small community having 5,000, a large community having 150. So there are some errors there. They might be typo errors, there might be whatever, but I'm going to find it interesting when I've paged through this, but I'm going to leave the particulars to Mr. Representative Johnson because he's the one that probably has more knowledge on that.
I was this study, by the way, and it was a fairly fast-paced study that we were asking a lot from this group, and they did a great job of putting numbers together. We sent them from our education department 19 million lines of code, and they took all of that information, they tore it apart. They took it down to the pencil point, and then they and put it back together again to come out with their best guess about the true cost of education or educating kids in Kansas. And I really appreciated the work they did, and we've already been alerted to the fact that there are some discrepancies and references to wrong charts and that kind of thing. And when they were working night and day on this thing to get it to us by our deadline. And so I have a feeling that the numbers that we have are generally correct, but there may be some modifying of numbers as we go through this thing to make it truly reflect the cost of education.
Well, this, I think, is the big discussion, so I'm glad to jump straight into it, and hopefully we can continue to hear from you. And there are no experts on this study. Senator Hardy and Representative Dirks and I happened to be in the same meeting yesterday where it was rolled out, so we got that information. I returned to the other topics that I mentioned. I've spent almost 30 minutes that I dedicated to it after that just to look through the study a little bit. So to the bigger questions and then into the details more, I think whether it's a win or a loss is more of this whole public discussion. I don't think it's us. I think it is collectively deciding with our patrons where we are, what we are able to do as we want to move forward. We can spend more dollars effectively in every area of government, trying to define exactly which piece within each. And many of you know some specific areas that we could spend effectively in. So that's the key to work together on that. So hopefully we can find ways that we all win together, and unfortunately at that point we usually all feel like we lost a little, being focused on, I don't want to pay more in taxes, or the needs are so great and how do I meet those needs, and how frustrating is it to only meet a portion of them. In the cost, if you get the study, which is now online, and you want to try and just get to the bottom line, it's on page 69 of the study. And on page 69, it walks through current K-12 spending, then what they call no compensatory support. So if we want to stay achieving the objectives we say we are achieving, if we want to stay here, what does that look like? And And then they look at scenarios A and B, and that's where you get the 1 and 2 billion numbers. Scenario A and B both assume a graduation rate of 95%. So that is a great aspirational goal. However, I would caution us on two things. To fund to that level today may or may not be what we all consider a win. I'm not sure I personally would consider it a win, although I'm thrilled to discuss that further. I'm not trying to start an argument, but I do want to start a debate on what we want to do. So currently our graduation rate is about just over 86%. The state with the highest graduation rate in the country is Iowa at just over 91%. We can and we should look to do better. My fear is if I say I want a 95% graduation rate within 3 years, is that I might get it. But what I think I will get is a change in the percent of students graduating and not necessarily a similar change in the performance of the students graduating. And again, I don't know that that's the case, but that's just the debate that I want to say. If I'm going to be that hard on KDHE and some other things to come up with $1 or $2 billion, is that how I want to spend it? And what is the rate with which I can deploy those numbers effectively as I try to get there? The other piece to the assumption, so they're both 95%, the difference between A and B is, I think they said we wanted 90% of students achieving at level 2, 3, and 4 in scenario A, and 60% of students achieving at levels 3 and 4 in scenario B. So that's to get to, and some of you probably understand those levels better than I do, so I won't try to get deeper in that. But the difference then is essentially 1.8 billion for scenario A, and I have to flip to 70, I'll call it 2.1 billion for scenario B. So they're fairly similar in those aspirational goals. And I think the Department of Education, I think Randy Watson as the Commissioner of Education, I think they're setting the right aspirational goals. I think Kansas Can and other things are leading us in the right direction. Do we fund at the level of the aspirational goal today? Perhaps. So let's go back to the baseline. Let's start there, where we are in this study. And is this study correct? It is going to be really interesting to compare the comments of our leaders from the day the study was laid out to the day the study was presented. And I did, after talking to Dr. Taylor, say, I think people are going to reverse what they have to say about this study in 2 weeks. That wasn't very interesting to print. But anyway, we'll see how that goes forward. So that asks for $451 million more dollars. However, it is based on year 2016-17. So in 2016-17, that's what we spent. In 17-18, we added just over 180 million. In 18-19, we're adding another 100 million. So if you look at that point, we would need another 170 million to fund at that level. Is that level sufficient? I don't know that that level is sufficient. Is it somewhere between those numbers? That's where I'm guessing the discussion goes, but that's where I start working through that. I think we might have wound up close to that number without the study, but so what that would mean is I need to put in another 20 to 50 million more this year and another 120 to 150 next year to get that. And realistically, we need a number different than inflation as we go forward. There's not one set assumption that's going to get us there. But I think it will come back to a continuing discussion of saying, what do we need to operate? How do we get there? Then the discussion of variables that I talked about. So I've got a number. What are the key variables? So chapters 4 and 5 go through those variables, and I am not there. But the biggest variable, and the biggest variable that matters, are teacher salaries. That's what we need. That's our big driver for getting to outcomes. I don't know the percent that is of education funding, but it should be a big percent of funding. So that is a big discussion. And how do we get there, and how do we get to where we need? I would argue that those salaries do need to continue to increase. Just as another one, and only to keep the arguments going, last week in the tax committee, they were studying the ROZ program, Rural Opportunity Zones. They had some 494 people, I think, that were participating in the ROZ zones. The largest number in ROZ that they had recruited were teachers. And the largest number of our employees, a lot of places are teachers. So I think that's a good fit. I was surprised at the state from which we had the highest recruitment. Overwhelmingly, the most teachers came from the state of Nebraska, which, interestingly, is the highest state in our region for teacher salaries. Now, I'm not going to pretend the ROZ zone tells us how that all lays out, but what I think it tells us is that salary is a key driver, but there are a lot of things that are also key drivers. And how do we make sure that we find that world that is attractive and supportive to the largest group and perhaps the most important group? I don't mean to diss any other group, but just by the sheer numbers as well as the importance of the work, it's a big deal. There's a lot of jobs that have very important work, so I don't mean to demean that, but by the numbers, this one's a big deal. So we need to figure out how we get that package right. Dollars are absolutely part of that. Diana mentioned due process. I think there are other things that are part of that, and getting that mix right is really important. So I think those questions, this report will be some tool that's useful. Ideally, in a report, I find the key variables and have the chance to change them just a little bit to do a sensitivity analysis to say, as you change that, where does that number come out? So I think the baseline is one to start from, and I think we just need to really discuss, is that aspirational goal of scenario A or scenario B what we intend to fund as a state, and how do we best meet that? So thanks for that discussion, and I hope we have a lot of chance for interplay on that.
Thank you. So you had said, so this is all going to work together. So you had mentioned that in April, we have an estimated increase in revenue of 200 million.
Well, that's Stevens. That's not an
Okay,
official
so,
estimate.
so that ties into, we all know that the tax on LLCs and S corporations was reinstated. And so this is kind of a two-part question, because I'm throwing in my own question. Because I know I have to write a big O check to the state of Kansas in April with my little small business. So is that 200 million probably the taxes that are going to be paid by the LLCs and the S corps?
Anybody else? So I think that one does fit pretty square with me. In part, I think the LLC and S corps were underestimated by about 100 million last year, and I think it could be more. There are several parts of it. So we're already up 100 million. So the total will be 300 million over last year's estimate. So those will be part. The other one that is coming in that's a big part is at the end of the year, we had a large run in the market, still having that. And in managed equity mutual funds, there was a payout of almost 10% in gain distributions. I don't know how big those will be in the state of Kansas. In a past similar year, we had as much as 200 million from that. I am guessing there's about 100 million from that, and about 100 million in increased revenue from both the LLCs, and that the growth is actually giving us more receipts from even individual taxpayers than are estimated. So I'm going to guess that at a minimum we're up 150 above the estimate for LLCs, including the 100 from before. We're up something more than 50 on individual income, and up something approaching 100 on capital gains payouts. So that's where I come up with those numbers. And yes, part of it is the increase on Joyce. So thank you for helping us out.
Well, I mean, it wasn't enough for me to hire another employee and do other things. So I was okay with reinstituting, the taxes on, but I get it. It's still another tax. Nobody likes it. So do you think that this tax will be eventually cut back to zero again? Was this reinstatement of those taxes on LLCs a stopgap? And do we think it'll eventually go back to zero?
So you'll get a different answer depend on who you ask. From me, I will say no, it will not go back to zero in Kansas, and it will stay at the individual rate. If there is a reduction in business tax going forward, I would assume a similar reduction in LLCs and corporate rates rather than only on the LLCs. But I think at our rate in Kansas of just over 5%, although it's 7% for corporate, I think that those rates are small enough that we'll see them continue to be married and have the same rate, a weak attempt at simplicity in rates depending on type. What we did see as we went from 180,000 to 330,000 businesses when we changed the income rate to 0, we think we saw more of a recharacterization of income than an increase of income. So that made several hesitant to go to the 0 route.
And what you need is sufficient revenue to take care of all of the essential services that Kansans expect from state government. And so you have that whatever that number is. If you desire to take a number, for instance, the tax on LLCs down to 0, then you have to compensate in some other area to make up that difference. And back in 2012, that was the fatal flaw, because Governor Brownback at that time did offer what he called pay-fors to balance the reduction of income tax for the LLCs. And during the legislative process, those pay-fors were stripped out of the bill. And so there was no compensating revenue to take care of that loss in tax revenue that the LLCs have been providing. So at some point down the road, we're going to be talking about things like, in fact, next week, we'll be talking about removing the state income tax, or not, I'm sorry, state sales tax on groceries. Well, that's fine and good, and it's a desirable goal, but we have to compensate for it somewhere else. So it just doesn't, we have to make things balance in the end. And that's the big challenge for state government.
Okay, thanks. The next 3 questions have to do with, is Kansas doing enough to support its citizens with the public safety nets such as DCF, mental health, healthcare, and I think this also relates to why do we still not have even a vote on Medicaid expansion when a supermajority of Kansans want it? And that goes back to Diana, I think you mentioned earlier about the percentage of our young children that are uninsured, so this is one big...
I'm a supporter of Medicaid expansion, and I'm a supporter for a couple reasons. I think that there are people out there that are hurting, that cannot afford traditional health insurance, but make too much money to qualify for Medicaid. And also we have providers, especially in the rural parts of the state, including Saline County, that are treating patients that are not being compensated for their work. And to me, I think that we have, I know we have, I think it's 100 and, well, it's 30%, let's put it this way, of our rural hospitals are showing signs of closing because they cannot be compensated for all of the work that they are required to do without compensation. So that's a big thing that Medicaid expansion could start to address. The other part that we have to think about is, well, just lost my train of thought. I'm going to let somebody else talk, and then I'm going to come back.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one that happens to. Okay. I did bring a sheet with me in case this question was asked. This is from the Kansas Health Institute. And people living in states that expanded Medicaid at an uninsured rate, almost half that of people living in non-expansion states, 6.5% compared to 11.6%. Racial and ethnic minorities in Kansas were much more likely to lack insurance than non-Hispanic whites. For instance, Kansas, who has Hispanic any race, were 3 times more likely, and non-Hispanic blacks were 2.5 times more likely to be uninsured than non-Hispanic whites, 19.8%, 16.1%, and 6.0% respectively. 4 out of 10, 43.1% uninsured adult Kansans had family income at or below 138% of the federal poverty level and may qualify for Medicaid expansion if it is expanded. 2/3, 67.8% of uninsured children in Kansas were in families with income below 243% and may already been eligible for Medicaid or CHIP. 3/4, and this is, everybody says, you know, they're not working, you know, they're not trying to make income. Well, 3/4, 75.3% of uninsured adult Kansans were working. Those working part-time were twice likely to be uninsured as those working full-time, year-round, 18.1% compared to 7.4%. These are numbers that change daily, so these are just, at this point, current. But it can change tomorrow because there are more and more individuals out there that are trying to make a living but are still getting minimum wage jobs, working for some entity that may or may not provide health insurance, or at least some kind of a pro-cost or payment of it. We see it every day. I know, you know, we've already had one hospital closed. The little hospital down in Wellington, Kansas, where we used to facilitate when I was working and we had the dairy farm, they are close to closing their doors as well. This has to be addressed, and every time we have an opportunity, it gets shot down. Or we get it passed, and then the previous governor vetoed it. And by 3 votes, we lost the override. So something has to be done. If we have to taper it down a little bit to make it more viable for perhaps somebody to vote on it, but this is not going away. And every time we have a bill where we find that it could be germane, it's tagged on. And we're hoping, a lot of times, we're hoping that we'll get it passed, but we know that sometime for another bill, we're going to hear it again. So I think people are talking. They want this. I know it's going to be a cost, but what kind of cost do you place on somebody's health and families who are desperately in need because they fall between the gap? A lot of this is individuals who fall between the gap. What can we do with it? Nothing again this year, but I'm hoping next year maybe we'll be able to finally get something accomplished. But I know we have to continue in the effort to do so, because otherwise those who are depending on us to help them and doing the best that they can need our attention.
All right, I can continue my thought now. Thank you, Representative Dirks, for giving me that moment. What it boils down to is revenue. And in the Senate, any measure issue that has included a revenue component has been buried in committee. And I think that everything is in that situation because we wanted to find out what was going on with education first. Because education was the elephant in the room in terms of revenue, and we didn't know how much of if we had available revenue, would be absorbed by education. And so once we have that firmly established, then we can start talking about other elements of the budget that require funding. Medicaid expansion on our part would take about $50 million, and that is that's real money, and it's money that we would have to take away from some other part of the budget that could use the money as well. So it's a matter of establishing priorities and determining which ones need to be funded first. Now that we have education to the point where we can start talking about it, I think that once we get that issue taken care of, then issues like Medicaid expansion then can become issues that we can talk about in terms of, well, where does this fall on the list of priorities now?
And if there's time for me to weigh in as well, these are the questions, so that is awesome. And if the moderator is okay later, I might ask if we can even do a poll on Medicaid expansion, on what you would like to invest in schools, and just kind of see where folks are. So the only thing that you'd have to promise is that you won't hate your neighbor if they vote wrong, right? But other than that, so I'll start with the needs in mental health, and the answer to the question is no, they're not met, and they're still not met. There have been some strides taken to help at Osawatomie. We need to do significant things to make sure we're meeting needs at Larned and keep those facilities open and taking care of the challenges. We have to go deeper. And while it is a cost to the state, in the end, I'm not sure it will all be an incremental cost, because we are having big costs in our schools. We're having big costs in our hospitals. We're having big costs at our local jails. We're having big costs to law enforcement, having to sit with people. We have to do better at this problem. And I see it ancillary from the funding side. I'm not deep in each day-to-day issue. I'm aware of it, but a huge thanks to so many of you who help get us through that day to day at each of those entities that I just mentioned, and I know I missed several. That is a big deal, and it does need more money. And I'll bet it needs 70 to 80 million more money, realistically, at the state level. And I may be low, but that's kind of where I would like to get in that world to address those problems better. I don't have a clear plan with how we get there. I do think as we address shrinkage in our revenue base, we will get better consistent growth in the revenue base to be able to address problems together going forward. So that's part of the goal. Medicaid expansion, yes, there is a cost. There is a concern about that. That's why I think it hasn't come up for a vote. It's got to get through the leadership process to get there. So how do you get it there? Let me take a little different approach. If I had a bill that changed the regulations on savings and loans to align them with banks, would you be okay on the floor if I brought an amendment that changed our gun law? If I had a bill on the floor that changed the regulation on savings and loans to align them better with banks, would you be okay if I brought an amendment to that bill on the floor that changed our gun law? So I'm just throwing something that I think is crazy out there. Well, what happened is there was a bill to expand Medicaid expansion brought on the bill to align savings and loan regulations with banks. That's a tough doggone vote. All of us have voted for Medicaid expansion, I think, each time it came up. Well, I'd like to see a work requirement myself. I would like to see us expand Medicaid. But if I vote for that amendment to be germane to the bill, because that was the vote I had, is this germane to the savings and loan bill? Now I've got to vote that everything's germane, in my opinion. And I could argue that I'm transparent if I voted for every amendment to be germane, but I know enough on tax that I don't want us to vet those tax bills on the floor. I want them to do, my ranking minority is awesome on tax. If we can't figure out a tax issue before we get to the floor, we're usually in trouble. So I actually like that process, and I hope we're making it work in the committees that I touch. And I know the Health Committee is so frustrated. I think there will be a way, and I rely on Representative Kincannon from Beloit. I think there will be a way that we get that up by the end of the session. I do share your frustration that it hasn't come up. I think the issues need to come to the floor. We need to have the debate for better or worse and move forward, and that's the best approach. But that's some of how we are where we are, and thanks for the feedback on that. And if the moderator lets me know if there's a time that's appropriate to do a poll before we wrap, we'll do it. But thank you.
You may have to remind me, but
Okay.
we'll do it. Okay, a couple of wage questions. And as an insurance agent who owns a pretty good-sized agency, I do a lot of bonding for contractors who are bidding city and state projects. And I know how they bid these jobs. So this next question, I know exactly where the money would come from if this happened. What is your position on allowing local governments to require more than federal minimum wages and benefits for workers as they contract projects? I know when they estimate their bids, they're just going to tack that onto the bid, and the taxpayers are actually going to end up paying that in the project. But go.
So thanks for the question. I don't know a ton on this, but generally I haven't supported increasing the minimum wage. I've generally supported the market rates rather than setting them at the government level. So I could talk longer, but I'll call it with that.
And also, what is the tipped wage for tipped employees? Is it $2.08? Is it $2.10? Anybody here know what that is? Is it $2.30 something? So we had another question that said, are you for raising the Kansas minimum tipped wage?
I'd need feedback from some folks working in that industry before I was rock solid on that. So sorry, I may have to punt on that one.
Okay. So any other minimum wage discussion before we move on? I know that's,
I have mixed feelings on this. I'm big on local control, and so I would at least be willing to listen to the discussion on local units of government weighing in on something like that. My personal feeling is that the market is taking care of a lot of the minimum wage issues. I noticed that Walmart's starting to pay $11 an hour minimum wage, and that is going to be a big driver for local communities as well. And I have a feeling that as you hit full employment, that businesses are then forced to look at wage to attract skilled workers. And the other part of it, though, that is interesting to me is that in Salina, Kansas, there are over 1,000 jobs that companies cannot find workers to fill. And that's because they are jobs that require skill. And I think education is starting to wake up to the thought that we have to provide workers that can provide the employment that the local companies are looking for, the welders or the computer analyst or the whoever. And as we start to look at what the needs are in local communities, then educational entities like K-State Poly or Salina Tech or whoever, or USD 305 can put together programs that are able to meet the needs. And those jobs are the ones that are paying $16, $17, $18 an hour. And I think that then we can really start to see some good things happening, at least in the local economy.
Thank you, Senator. You hit it right on the head. This is why bills such as the Kansas National Guard tuition assistance, that's not only for going to, K-State or KU, it's also our technical colleges to help pay for part of that tuition. And when they come out of the Guard, some opt to stay, some get out, leave with their time frame of 2 years. They already have something that they can utilize that will be a benefit to their communities, be able to give them a better wage because they're skilled. And that's why some of these types of programs and bills that we bring forth on the floor are so important. And it all goes down to 2 things: education and money. When our businesses are successful, they're able to pay more. They should be paying more Because if they're successful, they have a talented workforce who are making it successful for them. It's not an individual. When we had a restaurant in Abilene, we had the same waitresses the whole time we were there. And we made sure that they were paid well because they were doing the type of job that we needed, that brought people through the door, that added to our profits, and we wanted to share that with them. And this is what you're going to find if you have people who are educated in whatever field of endeavor that's going to get them a job after getting out of the Guard or out of high school. That's why it's so great that we have the programs now that kids are actually, I talked to one individual, he was getting his high school graduation and graduating from the tech school all the same time. And I think that is awesome, and we need to see more of that. So let's work on getting this education taken care of. It's been long enough. We need to make sure it has proper funding, and we have to make sure that we have entities that are going to encourage our people to stay in our communities and not leave and go somewhere else. So I think that's it in a handbasket. Thank you.
Since you brought up, since we're talking about higher education and workforce development, and I don't understand what the specific issue is, so if somebody had an example for me here, but here's the question. How will you make our public Kansas universities more accessible for students? Are they not accessible, and does somebody have a specific example why our Kansas universities are not accessible? Go.
I got a personal example. Now this is years ago, but my son was a K-State graduate. He tried working in the ag industry, didn't work out. Came back to K-State, asked K-State to, if he could fit in with a, put together a graduate program for him that would help him get certified to teach. And basically the answer was no. They wouldn't work with him. He went to Hastings College in Nebraska, asked them the same question. Yeah, we'll work with you. And he got a master's degree, got his teaching certificate, and he's now teaching at, Papillion South High School, a high school of about 1,500, teaching AP Physics. My opinion of some of Kansas universities, K-State in particular, is they're not very user-friendly when it comes to working with students. I had a similar incident with Fort Hays years and years ago. I had a similar incident personally with K-State years ago. So over my roughly 50 years in dealing with Kansas higher education, by the way, I got a good education at Fort Hays. I'm not complaining about that. Okay? But I've had some run-ins where I thought the schools were not at all student-friendly. But after you graduate, oh, here come the phone calls, and you contribute some money. My answer was always no.
I don't know much, but I have a feeling that when you get into the major public universities, that the flexibility is somewhat limited in terms of individual student desires or wants or needs, and then on the other side of it, if you would go to a Kansas Wesleyan or a Hastings College or smaller school, those schools may be better equipped to work on more of an individual basis with students. That would be my guess. It is, but it may just be the nature of the beast. In that if you are interested in a certain, that's why we have 19 private universities in the state of Kansas, is because sometimes those schools deal better with students that may be more of a niche student, students that are interested in the kind of education that your son was pursuing, instead of the cookie cutter approach that's used by a lot of the state universities.
K-State has a physics program.
Well, I don't know the specifics of your situation, but, mhm.
So,
I don't think that'll let you stand it.
it sounds like we have a few that want to weigh in, so I'll turn it back to Joyce if there are others that need to weigh in on the issue. I may not have anything to add. I appreciate the feedback, so that's useful. And it actually is putting a couple of other data points together as well as folks, not only from the student user, but some on research, were saying, no, we don't want to have to go to K-State because we don't think we'll get it done or moved forward. So there may be a couple of things we need to work with in that, not an area I deal with directly. The other related area would be we probably need to continue to look at our funding levels at K-State and some other places in terms of access for students on cost. Another key part is we look at the whole budget mix. So that's one I am aware of and continue to have some chance to look at in the budget committee. And I'll just say thanks for the feedback on the other to see if we can work on how we meet needs both upstream and downstream in education to those employing and those seeking employment as best possible. And I'll turn it back to our moderator to handle other questions on that.
Gotcha. I'm going to go ahead and move on from that topic because I don't think we have enough information on the accessibility for our public universities. I think that's a discussion that we just don't have enough information at this point to expand on. So I'm going to move on. This is a big one. What do you think Kansas schools need to be safe? Have budget cuts and actions by past Kansas legislators and former Governor Brownback hindered keeping schools safe?
So the question was, what do Kansas schools need to be safe? And do we have it? Do budget cuts get us there? I think budget cuts have made it challenging as you look at everything that needs to be there. I would offer that I don't think we have the answer at the state level because each facility is probably different. And I think we need to continue to work again. I think the adequacy of funding is one of the key questions to be able to do it. But I hope that we don't continue to pursue things to take control away from the schools to do what they think they need to be safe, and keep it there rather than trying to make it something we set up at the state level. So be curious of thoughts. I'll bet the person that has that question might have a good idea as well, and I would love to hear those thoughts also.
I know on the elementary school level, I know that they're trying to come up with things to make our elementary schools more safe. I mean, security, increased security, but again, I think I'll have to go along with Representative Johnson that there definitely is a need to make our schools safe at whatever level. And I hope that legislatively our hands might be tied at this point. But this is when our community becomes involved. And I would, when I send out my newsletter, I get great response with that, with emails and saying if they liked it or if they didn't like it. And that's when they ask questions. So I think community involvement with individuals such as yourself, and kudos for you for being here today. I'd like to see this whole room filled with some of our constituents because I'm sure they have some issues and want questions answered. But if you make yourself available, like this gentleman here in the front seat, he comes up to the State House and talks to me all about his particular issue. And I think that is what we need, is communication, not only with individuals living within our community on the local level, but communications with people living in our community on the state level, and community intervention and communication at the highest level. I think this is what makes our government work, and I think if we continue in that effort that things will get done. It may not be as expeditious as we'd like to see them, but eventually at least maybe we can moderately, one step at a time, make some individual changes. So please keep in contact with us. We can't guarantee results because we also have 124 other members on the House floor that we have to convince, but just keep in contact with us. Thank you.
This is a hot topic right now. I'm going to try to mesh a couple of thoughts here. Diana had mentioned putting some teeth in legislation for bullying for kids. And this is the thought that came to mind as all of our children were walking out of school in support of gun legislation reform. My issue was if most of our school shooters were what in school? Bullied, alienated from their peers. Instead of the gun reform that we want, why aren't we educating our young people on the brutal effects of bullying in our school system? We are, but are we as a country? I've been around kids, and they can be really mean. So what are we doing to prevent these kids from going back for retaliation?
First of all, we have great teachers in our community, but I think if we had that issue that you find in big major cities, I think it all comes down to funding and getting counselors, people who will listen, perhaps that are trained in that aspect, somebody that these kids can go to, parent consultations. A lot of times the bullying starts at home and not always in school. That kids need to be taught to be respectful of others. I mean, this goes clear back to when I was a little kid. You know, my mom says you treat somebody how you want to be treated, and I live by that. Sometimes. My husband will probably differ with that. But in all seriousness, unfortunately, the world twirls around monetary compensation. We can't get away from it. Money kind of rules the world, and you have to have it. And that's why it's so important to have good school funding, that we can hire those talented, educated educators who are in different fields that can work with these kids. And parents need to be also included in that conversation, because it doesn't do any good just to talk to the kids. You need to have the parents and find out what is the contributing factor, what is causing this to happen, is it starting at home, and what we can do to maybe help that a little bit. Maybe provide better jobs, increase employment opportunities. Maybe moms and dads are really struggling to make ends meet, and they lose track of what they're doing as far as a family unit. And I think this is where we need to concentrate on, is making sure we have the proper personnel to work with these families. And I think you'll see a decrease in some of the bullying, because these kids will be taught respect for others. That's where it starts. That's my answer anyway.
Okay, according to the Salina Journal, Ty Masterson says that nothing can be done about gun violence. Do you agree with that? And what changes to gun law are you willing to support and vote for?
So I imagine we should all weigh in on this one. So no, Ty is very articulate. I don't know that we agree on a lot. In terms of where I would start, I think if I were trying to address the law right now, I would just make the assault rifles have the same requirements as handguns. I think that consistency would be useful, so that, interestingly enough, handguns are more restrictive to purchase than an assault rifle, and I don't know why that is. So that would probably be the step where I would start in looking at that. Major changes, it is hard to regulate anything out of the hands of the people that I really don't want it to be in, but I think there may be an opportunity to allow those to get in the hands of folks that might have a use, but not have the quicker potential proliferation of those particular items would be where I would start on the law.
I think that, this bill that I alluded to earlier about people that are convicted of domestic violence would not be allowed to own guns. That's a step in the right direction. I think that having a registration system that is consistent throughout the country, that tries to identify people who might potentially be dangerous if they had guns that were easily accessible to them. Might be worth considering. And other than that, I don't know. I don't know that there's much that can be done. I took the concealed carry course in November just so I could be more knowledgeable about that process. And one of the items that was talked about was that, well, you ought to be buying hollow point ammunition for your pistols, because that does the most extreme amount of damage when fired. And I'm thinking, dang, this sounds like a war. This doesn't sound like self-defense. But it's the people that want to do harm in this country that also have that information. And to me, that's unfortunate that those kinds of things exist. But you can't segregate the populations of people that have access to that kind of ammunition or guns or any of that right now.
Can I ask you a question real quick on that course you took?
Sure.
In that course, the instruction that you had, did it entail active shooting in a stressful situation?
Active shooting in a,
Stressful situation.
well, it was just the driving or the shooting range element of it. You know, you're 3 yards away.
Very unstressful, right?
Correct. Very, very. That's exactly right. So you can't cover all situations in a concealed carry course either. That's true.
I would actually like to take my time on that, since it's been pretty well answered, because Representative Johnson also would like to have had conducted a survey of the audience, if you would be willing to do that. He has some questions.
Oh, yeah.
That you just kind of get an idea of your thoughts on that. And then I'd be happy to answer any questions on the other after we address.
We'll do it at the end. We'll do your issues at the end, and we'll do that.
You tell me.
Okay. So this is interesting, and I'm terribly curious about this. Why would the repeal of campus carry law fail in this day and age?
So I'm out of my wheelhouse on these issues. If the argument that I have heard for campus carry that I would most consider is if I had an 18, 19, 20-year-old daughter who I felt was proficient with the gun, traveling a campus, and I think of my experience at the University of Chicago, which is not relevant here, but I remember it was a big issue even when I was at K-State, and campus lighting and how we handled it. Perhaps there is a situation that many might support the ability of someone to have one. I don't happen to carry. I do support gun rights, but that is one argument that I think has held as to why there would be the campus carry issue. So that's the best I could come on a why.
Personally, I go back to local control again. I think that universities should have that option in terms of determining whether or not campus carry is a good idea or not. And once again, personally, I don't hear much about there being problems. And I'd be curious to know how many students there are that actually do that on our university campuses. It might surprise us about how few people actually carry on campus. So I keep track of what the pulse is on the universities, and I think the universities have adapted. They have metal detectors up in Allen Fieldhouse, for instance, and that kind of thing. But there are also very, very few issues in terms of problems that have been reported back. And so my thought is this may be something that turns out to not to be a problem on college campuses. It may be more of a marketing issue than anything else.
I only have two thoughts on that. First, that they have to have a permit, and they've had to gone through the training course, proper way of handling a weapon, simply because there are a lot of accidents that could happen if they're not required to have that. Those are two issues that I would really support, that they have the training and that they have a permit. I don't have a gun, never want to have a gun. Makes me nervous seeing one around, but you know, sometimes you have people's rights. But as long as they would at least have that training and that permit.
Next question. How soon might we have a bill allowing farmers to grow industrial hemp, a drought-tolerant fiber crop?
Well, I love that question. I have the bill. The Senate jumped on it this year and moved it out of committee, and it is in the House. I am assured we will have a vote on it with an amendment that I'm now comfortable with, but I'm going over it again, probably on Tuesday, and be able to move forward with rules and regs, which is the whole thing of getting through K-State, Department of Ag, similar experience with the department and the university. It does take a while, so if everything went at warp speed, that means we could be planting next spring in terms of starting to get an idea of how it works. But the bill, I'm reasonably confident we'll get it through. We don't necessarily know if we have the governor's support on the issue or not. In the discussion we had Wednesday night, it was indicated we did not have that support, but we're working on it, and I think we'll be able to get there.
I think another major hurdle is to get the feds to separate out marijuana from industrial hemp so that we can have a little more latitude in terms of marketing the product. Right now, you can grow it in Kansas, but you can't take it across state lines, and so that would make it quite a bit more difficult. And it's so we call it, we're in an experimental phase right now with it, but at least that's a first step, and there's a lot of potential for industrial hemp. I've heard there's like 100,000 different things you can do with it, and that would maybe change the landscape literally out in western Kansas.
Okay, so we're out of time, and we do want to do the polls. So do we want to do the polls first and then the closing remarks? What would you prefer?
All right, thanks. So again, the one rule I do ask, you can't get mad at your neighbor. But I have a bunch that I'd like to do. One is Medicaid expansion, whether you're for it or not. I'd love to go into more details on that, but we'll hold it to that. The next would be the level of school funding, and then if we had time, I'd be curious on the spending priorities. So which order do you want to take them in? Which one do you want first?
You're in charge.
Okay,
decide.
well,
You
let's do
call
the
it. You
Medicaid
call it.
expansion. How many would favor Medicaid expansion in the room? And those who would favor it do not expand. So thank you, appreciate that. Thank you for weighing in. And I know that this is not a scientific poll, so I don't want to pretend that that's it, but I appreciate the feedback. K-12 funding, I'll try and do a few options, and I'll start with no change, and then you can vote for more than one as we go up. So if you want to vote for every level of funding, that's okay, but if you want to say that's not enough, well, I'll let you do your poll later, Carol. And but I don't necessarily disagree with you, but I am curious where everyone would start. So I wanted to try and lay out all of those options. But I will let you tell me what other levels would you like? I was thinking of the 450, the 650, the billion, and the 2 billion. Should I go higher? Is that too many options? Okay, so we'll go through that. So and again, this is one. Even if it's not an option at the Supreme Court, just don't hate your neighbor. So who would like to not increase the school funding and stay where we are at the 3.6 billion? Okay, there's a few, so thank you. Who would go with the 450, the low number that's in the study? Who would go with the 659 from the Board of Education? A few at the 659. who would go to the billion is a little below, but I'll just go to $1 billion. It was actually $1.8 billion, I think. Okay, $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion. I'll do an auction now. $1.8 billion. $2 billion. So somewhere in that 650 to 1.8 in that range. Again, not scientific. It won't. But thank you for the chance to have
Now,
feedback.
you do have to pay for it.
Can I do one more?
Yeah, one more.
Okay, well, I get one more. The other would be your priority, and unfortunately, only the first one. So, and I'll throw out a few options for spending, and then if I miss one, I really apologize. So just yell at me at the end if you want something else. I'll give Medicaid expansion as one, mental health, K-12, roads, higher education. I got your back as an option. And another one that we had from the Salina set of priorities was to lower the food sales tax. So I know that's a different one, but it just changes the balance. Is there a major area that I'm missing? Can you live with those choices? Do you know which one you want?
And you only get a vote for one, right?
You can only
pick one.
So, and I'll try and look around to make sure I see when your hand goes up. Did I miss one? Agriculture? Okay, I'll add agriculture. So Medicaid expansion, funding side? Yeah, so I'm only giving you one, so I that is mean, I know. Okay, gotcha, thank you. Will you count for me? Okay, great. So the next one, mental health. Funding mental health. Okay, one. I think I've got 5. Thank you. Next one was K-12. K-12. I got 11. Roads. Two. Higher education. Thank you. I know there are votes. Okay. I only gave you one, so I'm sorry, but we have one. All right. Lower the food sales tax. 3. And agriculture. 2. And you could, everybody, there's no age limit on voting, so if you got up to show up, you can vote, so 3. All right, thank you so much, Joyce, thank you for the chance.
And Diana, what, you wanted to do a poll? You had mentioned it early, were you? You were good to go together? Okay, fantastic. All right, so closing remarks from you kids.
I just want to say very quickly, this afternoon I'll be doing one of my very favorite things. I helped celebrate 100th birthdays with a Senate tribute and a letter of congratulations from the governor. I've got 2 at Windsor Estates at 2 o'clock. One of them's going to be 106. And so that's going to be exciting. That sends tingles up and down me. That's other stuff that we do in addition to this kind of forum. So I appreciate everyone coming out, and look forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for the questions. I hope we got to hit on some of the key topics with you. Thanks for weighing in and putting up with the little poll at the end. I really appreciate that. It's going to get busy through the coming time. We're starting to get those groups of emails where we may get 50 or 100 on a topic that all of a sudden, if you sent me a really important email, it has disappeared. So if you've got a key topic, hit us like 3 times. Keep sending it and make sure that we have a chance to hear you weigh in on these topics and others as we go forward. But thanks again for being here. Thanks to the sponsors, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
I'm working on a project. I'm working with a 94-year-old World War II veteran who wants his China medal. For some reason, there's a bureaucracy and some red tape that's kept him from receiving that. So I have tried every single channel, and I'm down to my last resource, but we had 2 members of the Veterans Committee, participants with veterans, happened to be in Washington, D.C. this last week and talked to several people, and we're on our way. I need to get a picture of him actually being in China, because back then they would get on They did put them on a plane and take them where they wanted them, and they didn't have orders. So that's been the drawback for so long, and I've been working on this for 2 years, and I'm going to get it. If I'll buy him a medal, but we want that certificate that says that the United States military owed him this China medal. So that's my project, and if you have any comments on that, please let me know what else I might do. Thank you.
All right. The next legislative issues, I have difficulty saying that, legislative issues meeting will be held Saturday, April 21st, same time and location, so we'll see you back here on the 21st. Thank you to you three for joining us today, and you all, thanks for coming, and please stay in touch with your legislators, and thanks to our sponsor, AT&T, for helping us with the expenses today, and everybody will make it a great Saturday.